I'm Matt Elman, and you're listening to the Complete Confidence with Cambridge podcast. We've got lots of useful tips and tricks to help you plan your school year as you prepare your learners for their Cambridge English qualifications. Whether you've been teaching exam classes for years or just at the start of your teaching career, come along with us. We'll help you unpack the English language exam journey using our own real-life experience and easy-to-follow examples from the exam preparation course Complete. So, let's get started. Today's episode is brought to you by Greg Archer. Greg has been in English language teaching since 2010. He worked for 7 years in an international college, teaching Cambridge exam classes and managing the English language department. He's now a freelance author, teacher and teacher trainer, and is one of the authors of Complete Advanced.
Hello, and thank you for joining me for today's podcast. Today, I'm going to be looking at the idea of exploiting individual text and how this works in the classroom. We're going to be looking at the idea of an appropriate style or approach. We're going to think about how to create extension tasks and about this idea of advanced language and what it actually is. So, first of all, let's think about developing an appropriate style and approach. Well, the first thing to do really is to think about this idea of appropriate. What actually is appropriate? And I think this really gets to the heart of what being an advanced student can do. A C1 level student has a greater awareness of style, of register, of what type of text they're supposed to be writing, and what genre they're supposed to be writing within. And they have the ability to control the language in a way that suits each individual text. Now, this is important because they are going to have to write in different styles when it comes to the exam. But here we are in the middle part of the course. And at this point, the idea of what is appropriate should be getting a little more clear in the students' minds. They should be getting a better idea of what they need to do to produce a report or a proposal, what they might need to do to write a formal letter or a review, and understand the stylistic differences. I think it's a good idea as you go along this section of the course is to make comparisons between the units absolutely clear. Okay, so if we're focusing on writing, in Unit 5 they write a proposal. They deal with a review in Unit 6, and in Unit 7 you come to an informal letter. And Unit 8 you look at a proposal again. What you're needing to do as a teacher is to try and get them to think about and notice the differences between each of those texts. What's the style of an informal letter? Well, what does it mean? Don't just think about writing in an informal way. Think about the sort of language that's going to need to be included in that informal letter. This is the time really in the middle of the course where you really start sharpening their minds about what they're going to need to be doing eventually in the exam. You started the course by doing a lot of great language work, and you shouldn't forget that at all. That should be still part of your teaching. But now we sort of come to the stage where they're thinking, okay, well, what does it mean really to write an informal letter or a formal letter? For example, Unit 7, page 82 has a whole page of exercises that get students to practice using appropriate language. And in this case, it's a formal-informal register because the focus is on the informal letter. So, for example, they are asked to rewrite formal expressions into something more informal. And they have to write, "We can confirm that your forthcoming vacation." These kind of more formal sentences, if they can do it backwards and forwards, formal to informal and back again, give them plenty of practice in this. Because something very useful that you really start bringing your students' attention to at this point in the course is found in the exam advice box at the top of the page. It asks students to consider, before they write, who the reader will be and what they will expect to hear from you in this informal letter task. And this is a very important thing because it brings in this idea of target reader. I kind of often push that with my students, the idea of a target reader, and I try and get them to imagine somebody that they are writing to, rather than if they get a task, you need to write to the principal of a school. It's really nice to get them as well to kind of imagine someone that they're writing to rather than just start planning and write letters on the page. It creates that kind of personal dialogue. But it is this idea of the target reader. And you see these words target reader a lot in the teacher's handbook. If you haven't already done so, go online and download the teacher's handbook for the C1 Advanced exam. It complements Complete Advanced so well. It's enormously helpful and it's full of advice for teachers, not just in the way that it explains what happens in the exam and what each task is asking the students and the candidates to do. There's lots of practical advice for teaching. Now, you can download the Teacher's Handbook completely for free. It's available on cambridgeenglish.org. And as I say, if you haven't already done it, do it as soon as you possibly can. It is so helpful. And it's important to understand what is actually being asked of the candidates in each part. For example, in Part 2 writing, it says in the handbook, attention to every element in the question is essential for an effective response, and candidates should be careful to choose language which is appropriate for the chosen task. Now there's that word again, appropriate. So it is so important to kind of get them to understand you are writing for somebody. You are not writing to show off your advanced level of vocabulary or grammar. You are in a way, but that's not the point. It's not about how long you can make your sentences with commas or how many words you can put or how many unlikely words you would expect to see in a piece of writing. It's about thinking, who am I writing this for? And what you can also start them thinking about at this point is understanding their strengths and weaknesses. Okay, because in the exam, when they come to that, they have to write an essay for Part 1, but in Part 2, they get a choice of which text they write. They're given more than one. And if they start to understand now, my strength as a C1 Advanced candidate is probably more towards writing a report than a formal letter, or I'm a little bit more comfortable writing an informal letter, then that's where they can start to think about, I've got an idea of what I'm going to choose to write on the day. And this is the thing that I find often happens with students, is that they think, I'm going to write an informal letter because I quite enjoy speaking and I like saying things in an informal way. Make sure they know what it means and what is required to write an effective informal letter. It's not just about write an email or a text like you would to your friends. So this is the big thing that I would suggest at this point. Make sure you and the students really start to understand the demands of each task and each part of the exam. Now I'm going to spend a moment thinking about this idea of creating extension tasks and activities. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, there are some fantastic activities in the book. They are there throughout, and if you feel more confident in sticking to what the book is asking the students to do, then there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. It is all there to help you, and also the teacher's book. But if you feel a bit more confident in what you're doing, the idea of creating extension tasks is really to think about, well, we've got this activity in the book. Is there anything that I can do to push the students a little more to develop their language skills? I mentioned in the first podcast about this idea of mining language out of a text, and that's a huge part of what you really need to be doing, and making the most of anything that's available in every text. But thinking about actual extension tasks in terms of what the students are going to be doing while they're doing that. Well, if you are struggling for ideas, or if you're feeling a little less confident about doing that for yourself, then the teacher's book is great for suggesting extension activities. For example, in Unit 5, there are 6 extension activities suggested. And it's basically, once you've done this particular activity, why not try this? You don't have to use them, of course, but they're really useful. There's one of the activities in there that is written specifically for what to do for fast finishes. So if you've got students in your class who kind of finish before everybody else, there's an extension activity in Unit 5 for them. We've also got the Teacher's Handbook. It really helps us to consider what an activity is designed to do. The Teacher's Handbook, if you read through that, it summarises what each part of the exam is testing. For example, on page 9 of the handbook, it talks about reading and use of English Part 7. And it says, in this part, there's an emphasis on understanding how texts are structured and the ability to follow text development. Now, what does this mean? Well, this is essentially about written discourse. This is a way that a text fits together. Things like reference words and creating a continuity and a logical development. So if you know what that part of the exam is testing, then maybe you can start to think about how extension activities can help to support that. Let me give you an example. Reading and Use of English Part 5, and this is from Complete Advanced, and it's on page 64. So Part 5 is where they have a text and they get 4 multiple choice options for each question. The Teacher's Handbook says that in this part of the exam, Reading and Use of English Part 5, there's an emphasis on the understanding of a long text, including detail, opinion, tone, purpose, main idea, implication, attitude, and also text organisation, including features such as giving examples, comparisons, and reference. Now, there's a lot there for you to think, well, is there something we can focus on? But here's an idea. The questions for this particular text. If we look at question 1, it says, in the first paragraph, the writer is expressing her, and the students have to choose the correct option of 4 that completes that sentence. And it says, in the first paragraph, the writer is expressing her A, regret that so few photos exist of her mother's family holidays. B, surprise at the lengthy process of amateur photography in the past. C, appreciation of the photo technology available today. D, amusement at her grandparents' limited photography skills. So we've got 4 different ideas there: regret, surprise, appreciation, and amusement. The correct answer is B. She expresses surprise at the lengthy process of amateur photography in the past. But why not, once you've looked at this in class and you've said, yeah, B is the correct answer, why is it? Why not just push them a little more and say, do you want to rewrite that paragraph so that there's more of the idea of regret that so few photos exist? Why don't you rewrite the paragraph and it's more expressing amusement at her grandparents' limited photography skills? So what you're doing is taking a paragraph from a text that you might have covered in class and asking them, well, have a go at this. Rewrite it so that you are pushing yourself. And this is a really fun extension activity I've done very often in class, because it gets the students thinking about this idea of appropriate language. What is appropriate for this particular idea of amusement or regret? Now, even though at this point we're kind of moving towards the halfway point of the course, please do keep your main focus on language development and not too much towards exam practice. How useful is it really for students to do repeated, authentic, timed exam practice at this point? Extension tasks can be very, very much focused on language development, and you're better off focusing on improving language skills rather than practicing exam technique at this point. But nevertheless, it's a good time to start raising awareness of what will eventually happen in the exam. So, one final point that I want to end on in today's podcast is this idea of advanced language. What exactly is advanced language? If you've been teaching advanced level students for a while, you'll be kind of familiar with this idea already. But if you're new to teaching advanced students, or you haven't taught for the C1 exam before, really think about what advanced language actually is. It's not just about showing off complex grammar. It's not about writing long, overly complex sentences. This again goes back to the idea of what is appropriate. So think about what it is to be an advanced language user. If we look through units 1 to 4, which maybe at this point you've already covered, look back at the unit map or look back at your notes and you'll see that collocations were a real focus in each of the vocab sections in units 1 to 4. They come up again in unit 6 and unit 7. And unit 5, the focus is on idiomatic language. Now, it says specifically idiomatic language. This is not suggesting that you should try and teach your students or get them to remember lots of old-fashioned idioms, like it's raining cats and dogs or it's just not my cup of tea. This is not necessarily what being an advanced language user is about. Idiomatic language is that kind of figurative language that's used by high-level users of the language. For example, on page 54, there's examples here. Jump the queue, to get off lightly. And this is the thing to focus on, and successfully using these kinds of phrases and this sort of language will help them to get a higher score in their productive skills, in their writing and speaking, particularly if they know whether it's appropriate to use that language in a given context. Now, as I said a moment ago, this is not the stage of the course to really start honing that exam technique, but raise awareness of what might happen in the exam and why we're doing all this work on language teaching. So, for example, this phrase, it says on page 54, this is in exercise 1, question 3, what does it mean if you get off lightly when something bad happens? Well, it's not just about learning this phrase, get off lightly, it's knowing where it's appropriate. Is this more appropriate for speaking or writing? Well, it could be both, but it depends on what you're going to be writing. If you're writing a report or a formal letter, maybe it's less appropriate to use it then. It's certainly appropriate for the speaking part of the exam, but this is the idea, getting the students to understand where they can use the language in any given context, particularly when it comes to exam day. Now, a couple of pages after that idiomatic language on page 54, there's a reading exercise on page 56. It's a part 7 reading. Is there, like I was saying before, can we mine this text? I talked in podcast 2 about, can we mine this text? Is there anything that we can find in this text that would add to what we've already been doing? And in fact, right in the first paragraph of the reading on page 56, it says, despite being an enthusiastic amateur cyclist, I'd been stuck at home for a while due to bad weather. Stuck at home. That's idiomatic. That's something to add to what they've done a couple of pages previously. Do they understand it? Can they use it confidently? Again, this is the idea of them being autonomous and saying, yeah, I understand what it means, but I'm not entirely confident I would be able to use it. So this is what we're pushing them to do. It's all part of the process. It's all part of the language work that they're going through. If you haven't already watched my webinar called Bringing It All Together with C1 Advanced, there's a lot more kind of detail about this and more ideas that you can kind of use to help bring something into the classroom. And it's available on cambridge.org/complete confidence. So if you want a few more ideas to lend to this podcast afterwards, why not go and have a look?
Let's recap.
So that brings today's podcast to a close. Thanks very much for joining me. We've looked at these ideas of appropriate style and appropriate approaches and appropriate language. And we've looked at the idea of creating effective extension tasks and considered this idea of what advanced language actually is. Because in the end, what we want our students to do is to develop control. We want ourselves and we want them to identify opportunities for language development. And it's all about building confidence at C1 level. Thanks for listening.
That's it for today. Discover more episodes from this series on our website, cambridge.org/complete confidence. We have podcast episodes for every level of the Cambridge exams. Come back and join us again soon. And don't worry, you've got this.
You've been listening to the Complete Confidence with Cambridge podcast, brought to you by Cambridge University Press and Assessment.